All right, and welcome back to the Movie Pope podcast. And today we are going to dive into Dune Part 2. And this is a movie that we saw yesterday, Lee. Now, now for Dune Part 1, we did have the benefit of, of watching it and rewatching it to kind of, absorb the information here. But, seeing in theaters, as great of an experience as it is, there's just so much information to absorb. Even when the pacing is pretty slow, I mean, you're still having to absorb so much information. Now, I mentioned this to you yesterday in theaters, but the first half really does give this Lawrence of Arabia vibe to it. It's like, you have these like dramatic shots of the desert landscape, and then you have Paul Atreides, who's pretty much, and he's pretty much is Lawrence of Arabia because he's fighting alongside the Fremen against House Harkonnen, who have since reclaimed their stewardship of Arrakis. So for the first, well, I mean, what can we say, like 45 to 60 minutes of the film, it's Paul basically, coming to terms with his identity as a member of the Fremen, as well as trying to retain his identity as the next Duke Atreides. But what were your thoughts on part two after seeing it?
Yeah, I mean, I thought part two was a great continuation, right? I think it does a really good job of helping kind of see that shift, right? So we kind of deal with the first one where we see, House Atreides totally gets, kind of destroyed overnight. And we see the Harkonnen kind of come into the power. And then we start to see how, Paul really kind of takes this ragtag group of rebels, so to speak, and we start to see him, becoming kind of this stronger leader, right? And it's funny because in the first one, he talks about how, he doesn't want to be a leader. That's not what it's about. And then his father was like, it's funny you should say that because really to be a good leader, it's someone that doesn't actually actively look for leadership. And it's funny how true that becomes because he pretty much does everything he can to avoid kind of this prophecy or for him to kind of fulfill his role as being this leader. And he does everything he can to not do it. But eventually the pieces kind of fall into place and that's what ends up happening. So I think they, like I said, do a great job of showing how, he starts to really get this kind of strong relationship with the Fremen where they start to view him as like, okay, now he's a strong fighter. He's starting to do all of the stuff that we're expecting this prophet to be able to do. And we sort of see how all that builds up to kind of this climax of him kind of taking kind of that ultimate leadership role.
Well, I mean, let's also keep in mind too, the Bene Gesserit, play a much more prominent role in part two than they did in part one, right? Because we begin to see what their motivations are being fleshed out, all the more, right? Because because we come to find out that it was the Bene Gesserit who kind of put the word in the Emperor's ear that, hey, maybe House Atreides, maybe we shouldn't trust them too much, so let's go ahead and set them up to fail. And they kind of kind of like string him along to where he makes that deal with House Harkonnen to basically carry out the events that we saw in part one. What were your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I think it becomes obviously a lot more apparent in the second one how much pull the Bene Gesserit has, right? And we start to see kind of their power, right? So you have Lady Jessica that's there. She's, pregnant with a daughter who converses a lot during this. I do find that very interesting that
Yeah.
we have
Yeah.
this not even a child, right? This unborn baby that plays really kind of a critical role. So we see, we see Lady Jessica. She drinks the water of life, and she becomes a reverend mother, which is kind of one of the highest, if not the highest, kind of in the whole, I guess, hierarchy of the Bene Gesserit.
So let me so let me ask you this: Do you kind of get the feeling that every planet has a Reverend Mother, or if there's
Yes,
just like
yes.
okay,
Yeah, I would say not only every planet has a Reverend Mother, but it seems like just depending on like it's just kind of that like religious leader, right? So I guess like if you have a church that's in your area,
It's like a bishop,
that
basically.
yeah, exactly. Like
Okay.
he's kind of the closest thing that you have. So there's probably some people over it, but that's who you have in your area, so to speak. So, but yeah, we do have this Reverend Mother, and as I said, like she's kind of you start to see for Jessica, right? She starts to play a much more integral role in Paul coming to power.
Yeah,
And
because
I do
she
have to admit, this is
Yeah, because she's
yeah,
going around actually spreading the word about Paul. Because
yes,
and that's what I find so funny is the fact that here's Paul up in the north. He's like, yeah, I'm not this guy you keep going on about. I mean, I don't know who you're talking about. I just want to be a Fremen. I just want to hang out with you guys. And Lady Jessica's like pushing him along. She's like, no, you have to fulfill your destiny. This is who you are. And she's going around and she's basically going around whipping up the all the tribes up north, and then she goes down south to basically spread the word just so everybody can come to accept him for for being the quote unquote messiah of the Fremen. But but a part of me kind of has to wonder, like, like sub, is she sort of like manipulating him subconsciously to accept it, or is it something that he kind of is forced into because of the circumstances that she creates?
yeah, I would, yeah, I would absolutely say it's a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B because I do find how like it feels like they have an extremely close relationship in the first one, but it starts to feel like that relationship becomes strained. I definitely felt like in the second one where they have a much more strained relationship because for her, right, she's doing this because she really wants Paul to believe who he is and is trying to get him to, not be fearful of what he's going to become. But in that same token, I think that starts to create more of this disconnect because for Paul, this is not something that he wants, but it feels like Jessica's almost forcing it upon him that like, hey, look, this is your reality. Like you don't have to accept it. Or excuse me, it might not be the reality that you want, but you have to accept that this is what's going to happen.
And can I
So
just preface too? I mean, I mean, he's having these repeated dreams of billions. Did you say billions or millions dying because of a holy war in his name?
yes, yeah, absolutely, and I do believe it was bees and billions.
Okay, gotcha.
So it is a huge thing. So yeah, there is obviously a lot of kind of turmoil there, and they're all looking for this idea of something called the golden path, right? This kind of one reality where things just work out really well. And I think for a lot of us, it's very hard to really grasp that idea, right? It's kind of like I guess to use a similar idea, it's the idea of in Infinity War, where Doctor Strange is like, yes, there's a lot of paths where everything dies, but there's one path where everything works out, or at least the ultimate goal works out. But unfortunately, there's sacrifices along the way. This is very much in that same breath, where Paul kind of eventually gets these powers, where he's able to start to see the future a lot more clearly than he's seen previously, and because of that, he understands what he needs to do. It's just that unfortunately, what he needs to do um, is not always the greatest thing for anybody, right? Either for him, for his relationship with Chani, like there's so many things that he has to do because he sees the ultimate goal, but we as the audience, we don't really understand. We start to not fully grasp his motivation, but I think that's just because he has all this power now that what he sees is ultimately what he's aiming for.
I mean, we'll also keep in mind too, because because what happens at the end of part one kind of sets the stage for what we see in part two. Because before Paul is pretty much this, I guess naive, would be a good word. He's sort of like this young
Yeah.
naive ingenue who's like most of what he learns comes from books or film books, I should say, and and most of his fighting skills are pretty much done in sort of like a staged area, right? So so for the most part, he's lived a pretty sheltered life. So being thrust into the wilderness, um, as a war, taking his first life when he kills Jamis, and then slowly rising through the ranks of the Fremen to kind of become one of them, and leading these raids on the Harkonnen spice operations. It kind of changes him, really. Um, and in a way, you kind of get the sense that he understands that this is something that has to happen if he wants to survive. Um, so when he does eventually embrace his destiny, as this was it Lang Al Gaib, he he comes to a realization that this is the only way to survive. Um,
Hmm.
he can't just keep hiding out and being a nomad or anything. He has to rise to the top. Now, so this is something that came across my mind as I was watching the movie, because y- because for all the influence and power that Paul has, he is pretty much being influenced by two women. Obviously, his mother, Lady Jessica, who was asking him to fulfill his destiny, and then Chani, who wants him to remain this young, free spirited guy as a Fremen. Um, did that dynamic ever cross your mind as you were watching that
Oh yeah,
movie?
for sure, right? And I think this is where a lot of that pull starts to happen, right? Because you have his mom who is trying to get him set up for this, and really, it's kind of like he's been built up since a very young age that that's what he's about, right? He's gone through all this training, he's done all this stuff where he just wants where everyone's kind of expecting this bigger and grander thing, right? Like if you really think about it, he's got this whole backstory of being this kind of leader of the Bene Gesserit, this male character that's going to kind of take this huge role in their life. And also in doing this, he also has kind of on his father's side, it's him taking over House Atreides, this really strong house that has, kind of like a lot of momentum around them as being such a big thing. So for Paul, like he's kind of always had this like really like kind of prophetic idea that he's going to be something so huge and so great. But really, we see him, he's just okay, being a part of the Fremen, right? Like he's not interested in that role. So I think, Lady Jessica is a side of him that reminds him that he has all this great potential and, he has all this huge things that he has to aspire to. Whereas, Shawnee is just there to be like, hey, you're just a normal person, right? Like you don't have to do all this. Like you can just enjoy what you're doing and be who you are. And I think that that's something that he has kind of a turmoil with is like, do I follow my mom and become this bigger thing, or do I follow Chani and I just get to just be another Fremen and just be able to do what I want to do without kind of leading down this path that has all this bloodshed behind it. So it is something where both these characters I think play kind of you have to kind of side with one or the other, so to speak.
Yeah, because I mean, like in part one, you see that dynamic between Leto and Lady Jessica, because Leto wants him to be, Duke, Paul Atreides, right? The
Hmm.
next in line, whereas his mother wants him to be, more than that. This transcendental figure who, leads the world in a new direction, and that theme kind of continues. Whereas it's just split, two ways. You can sort of see it split as three ways, because it's, does Paul become, this Messiah? Does he become, the next Duke of Atreides, or does he, become this Fremen character who just lives out in the desert? So, so if you think about it, it's kind of split three ways. Like, which way do I go? And you kind of see that conflict. Playing out in his head, because and I was gonna say, our good friend Chris, if you're watching, hey buddy, he actually did point out yesterday that if you think about it, the pacing of the movie, is pretty much spent, with Paul just saying, I don't want to go south, I don't want to go south, I don't want to go south. If you want to go south, and I'm just gonna stay up here in the north. And then when he does go south, everything just kind of like, what was going at like 10 miles per hour just goes to 100 miles per hour. Everything is
Yeah.
just like, just put it into fifth gear, and just go right on ahead. What did you think about the pacing and everything?
Yeah, no, and I mean, I agree, and I think ultimately that was always going to kind of be the case, right? Because I think once he takes over that ownership role of, he drinks the water of life, he kind of fully gets the powers of the Bene Gesserit that he's been kind of training for. So eventually, when he gets that, obviously everything changes, and I think that was always going to kind of be the case. It definitely feels like everything goes to 100 really quick. So yeah, I do agree that the pacing could be maybe a little bit more jarring, but ultimately, I think it's a way for them to kind of show that transition from being this kind of minor character that's just okay with being behind the scenes, and then he just kind of gets catapulted in this role of like, okay, I got to accept my destiny, like this is what I need to be able to do. So yeah, it definitely can be very jarring with how they look at it.
So once Paul does accept his destiny, like he begins to he begins to show himself as um a much more capable figure, which he sort of was at the beginning of the movie, but but once he drinks the water of life and once he embraces his role, he begins to take on a more active military role in leading the attack. um
Yeah.
so obviously the one scene that comes to mind is when they discover the was it atomic weapons or nuclear weapons that his great grandfather had buried somewhere.
Yeah, I believe they described it as an atomic stockpile.
Okay, yeah. I mean, when that scene happened, I was like, yeah, he's definitely going to use that, like
Yes.
against the Harkonnens. Um, and speaking of Harkonnens, we actually did get introduced to do Baron Vladimir's other nephew. Was it Fade Ralpha, played by Austin Butler? And can I just say, like, can I just say we for the very few moments that we saw him, he did a phenomenal job as that villain.
Agreed.
Um, and also, can I just say the home world of House Harkonnen pretty much just shows just how evil these people are because everything is literally in black and white, and the way that they appear, it's just I mean, they look like vampires, dude. Like it's like I mean, I was just thinking to myself, I was like, if I was on that planet, I would just be at unease the entire time because
Hmm.
you really have no idea of who to trust. Um, I mean, it seems like the only stranger on that world who seems to feel at home is that Bene Gesserit lady, played by Leia Seydoux, who ends
Hmm.
up sleeping with Fed Ralpha, and having his kid, or or thinks having his kid. Um, at the Reverend Mother's direction. What were your thoughts on the whole Harkonnen storyline in part two?
Yeah, and I would say you're absolutely right, and I think that it was very purposeful that it was very black and white because it does feel absolutely jarring. So it definitely takes some time to get used to just kind of seeing the world the way that is. And yes, I do agree that Butler did a great job portraying that character, and I like how they talk so much about like their fighting, but it was interesting that there's kind of this gladiator event that happens, right? With Fade Rotha being kind of the main one, and he's fighting against three people, and actually two of them have been drugged, right? So like these people are going out there very clearly not in top fighting shape. Now, one of them is, but definitely looks like kind of an older one, right? Like the two ones that he kills first are the ones that are drugged, and they feel absolutely like they're the stronger ones. The third guy feels a little bit weak, and I think that just kind of goes to show kind of the kind of the corruption that exists there, right? Like they're having these events, but really the events are there just to kind of just be free kills, right? Like there's not a whole lot of stress there. Now, for the third person that they fight, it ends up, he's not drugged and he's looks like a pretty skilled fighter. So I think it kind of shows that they do have some fighting prowess. But I did find it very interesting that they were drugging people prior to it, which just to show that maybe they're not as talented or strong as people are led to believe. And really, for me, for the final part, I felt their whole kind of storyline was rather underwhelming, right? I felt like they played such a critical role in the first one, and the second one, it's like they constantly are being bested by Paul and the Fremen. And I think that's a very stark contrast because we see the first one how they go in there, they absolutely dominate everything and pretty much wipe out Atreides on one night. And then the second one, it's the polar opposite, where now they're looked at as being rather weak. They're not really able to, really do anything. And even though they show this, Fade Ratha, he kind of is a rather underwhelming character, right? Like it's played very well, but his actual conflict with the story is very weak. And really, the only time we see a whole lot of them is at the very, very end, where he kind of fights with Paul one on one. But I honestly did feel like they were relatively, they didn't play as big of a role as I thought they would play. That's just
Yeah,
me personally. Did you kind of share similar?
yeah, I agree because because the way they got built up in part one, you kind of think, oh well, obviously these two guys have been going there for centuries, and Paul even mentions this too. He's like, you guys have been fighting for only hundreds of years, we've been fighting for centuries. So you think that there'd be a lot of a lot of vehemence and more involvement of the Harkonnens, but they actually take a backseat role. It's more. I mean, if anything, I mean, if there really is a antagonist, I guess you could sort of say it's Jessica in a way
Yes.
because she's
Yeah.
because she kind of moves into this role where it's like, you're not really my son, you're just this object now, right? Whereas in part one, you can tell that there is sort of like a concern for the two of them, between the two of them. Here it's like Lady Jessica's like, this is what you have to do, all right, so go do it. And Paul's just like, well, I don't want to do it.
I don't wanna.
Yeah, exactly. And really, and really, you think the Harkonnens, were like, oh, so they're just not in the picture anymore, because we only see brief glimpses of them, and we only see them actually come into full view near the end when the Emperor arrives on Arrakis. So so I do want to I do want to shift to the end of the movie where Paul launches this final attack. And can I just say, like, his him taming the sandworms and riding them, there's got to be a meme somewhere called ride the worm out there, like that's got to exist, and if not, we should start it.
Yeah, that
Hashtag ride
was
the worm.
yeah, that was such a cool sequence, right? That battle at the end where they kind of like use the nukes and they use the nukes. I think initially, I know I was like, huh, that was kind of weird how they're using it. Like, I'm not quite sure I understand, but then once I kind of thought about it, I'm like, oh, this goes to just that really excellent strategy, which once again harkens back to the idea, right? That Paul is, he's been studying this place before and now he's been really living in it. So all that experience that he's gotten is, made him into this great battle tactician. And obviously, I'm sure having powers to foresee the future probably helps out a lot as well. But I think we kind of see that in full effect, where they kind of shoot off some of these atomic weapons. It destroys part of this kind of mountain that's in the back of the stronghold that the Emperor and House Harkonnen are at. And like with him destroying it, it kind of opens up the floodgates for all these worms to come through, which I thought was such a cool scene, right? Seeing like multiple worms just coming through there, and obviously the worms just absolutely decimate all the troops on the ground.
Yeah.
And I just thought that was such a cool scene where we see kind of this attack from all sides, and really, I just the whole scene where you see kind of like the Emperor's kind of holed up in this room, and you see Paul enter, and he's just is a man on a mission, right? Like he has one mind, he has a one track mind for what he wants to do, and he walks right up to Baron Vladimir there and just kills him. And I love that, right? Like everyone's just sitting there, like you don't know what to expect, what he's gonna do. But the first thing he does, he just bypasses everything. He walks by guards, he walks by everything, and he just goes there to take care of Baron Vladimir, which I thought was such a cool scene.
Who let's remember we find out is his grandfather, by the way.
Yes, correct. Yes. Um, yes, interesting. Once again, how very how much of a factor the Bene Gesserit play with all this. Just a very interesting way of how they're handling everything. But yeah, so it is just like I said, such a cool sequence where I think we've all been waiting for that moment, right? The guy that killed his father, and he's finally able to kind of get that retribution, and kind of takes on that moniker, right? Like he's for the longest time, just kind of, wanted to do this. And then, he's got the ring on and, he's really taken over the idea that now I am, I'm now the Duke, right? I'm now the leader of House Atreides. And it's just a great full circle moment, him being able to get that retribution.
But I mean, like, and I mentioned this before. I mean, there's this conflict before of him trying to decide which role he wants to embrace, and now he's kind of
Mhm.
embracing all these roles. He's a Fremen, but he's also, the Messiah, but he's also, Duke Paul Atreides. So he's like all three. Like, I guess you could say he's sort of like this sort of Trinity figure, really. um, but um, but what I find so interesting is the fact that once he's drunk the water of life, he goes all in. He's 100%, you know, into the idea that he is that person. He is the Lis Al Gaib that everyone's spoken of. Because remember that scene where he's in that cavern and he's like talking to all these people. And he tells that one guy about his dead grandmother, and you're like, well, this is some pretty freaky shit going on here. Like he like I don't know if he's like reading his mind or if he's just able to communicate with like people across space and time or what, but that's just really, really uncanny of what he's able to do. But it works to get people on side.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And um,
So so at the end of the movie, the Fremen pretty much have decided. Did you know? We believe in our Messiah. We're gonna embark on this holy war. So it kind of fulfills the dream that Paul had. But even before then, he pretty much says to the Emperor, you're basically gonna make me your heir. And I'm gonna marry your daughter, and that's that, right? Um, do you? Well, this is something that's been bothering me since I watched it. What was that message that Paul sent to the Emperor? Was it like a declaration of war or what? Do you know?
yeah, I don't know if they said it, but I think it was just to come across that Paul was alive, right? Because I think for the most part it was, and I think there was a very kind of clear threat there because obviously the Emperor had kind of done this all behind the scenes without anyone's real knowledge. So the fact that Paul was alive was a huge issue to him because if he was to spill the beans about anything, then it's there. But yeah, I don't recall if they ever said specifically what was in there. But I think it was enough to get obviously the Emperor to realize that, oh no, Paul is really alive, and that means that technically House Atreides lives on.
Yeah, and
So
plus they mentioned too that if the other houses were to get word of what he did, they would all pretty much go to war against him. Um,
oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
yeah,
And I think him taking the hand, right, of the Emperor's daughter there, I think was that kind of very clear transition that, he's accepted the role of who he is, right? Because we know he has this very deep relationship with Chani. We see that throughout the whole thing, right? That's, what he's been building up to. And we see, what a critical role that she plays in this whole thing, including being one of the kind of leaders of like when they're doing the battles, like she's leading a group from the West or something. I don't remember what direction, but like she plays a very critical role in this. And we kind of see him, even though he tells her beforehand, like, I'll love you always. But he realizes that in order for him to further his rule, for him to ultimately kind of take that stronger leadership role, that his wedding to this daughter is what's most important. And I think you kind of see him starting to veer more on that path, that what's most important for him is this kind of idea of being this ultimate leader, because like he's able to lead people to this more peaceful time. And unfortunately for him, that means that he has to forfeit some of himself. So I think that was, like I said, probably, I know for some of the people that were with us at the movies, was not something they like to see, kind of seeing Chani almost cast to the side. But I think for, kind of the story, and, whether you want to look at it as a good thing or a bad thing, it's Paul kind of giving up that aspect of what he's been about.
Yeah, yeah. So what do you think about the ending where the Fremen board those ships and they go off on their holy war? What were your
Thought
thoughts?
it was, yeah, I mean, I get it. I kind of made the joke at the end, like, I don't know if they know how to fly those things. Um, I guess you could make the argument someone else is doing it, right? Like, I'm sure there's,
Yeah, yeah,
other people are doing it, but yeah, I mean, super, super gung ho. So was very, like I said, was interested to see that. But obviously, the whole idea is that it's building up to the Holy War that you mentioned, and now that's kind of the start of it. So kind of interesting how this one ends with kind of this idea of a larger holy war happening. And also interesting too that like we don't even know if there's a third movie at this stage. Um, so
yeah,
it absolutely feels like it's building up to this, right? And now we have this holy war that's going to happen, and we may or may not ever see the conclusion of that. So kind of an interesting way for it to end, but it is staying true with what the source material is, and that's
yeah.
what we
Because I
got.
mean, because I mean, Dennis Villeneuve, has said he's not ruling out the idea of doing a third movie. It
Yes,
would just have
correct.
to,
Yeah.
it would just have to be something that they kind of, I, I guess to paraphrase that could be bigger or outdo what he did in parts 1 and 2.
Yes.
Um,
Mhm.
Plus, he has the benefit of having the source material, the completed source material, um, that Frank Herbert left behind. So like so if he were to make a third movie, obviously he would pick up at Dune Messiah, but then the question becomes: does he follow Dune to the letter? Because because in Dune Messiah, it kind of takes place several years after the Holy War,
Yes.
so we don't
Mhm.
know if really we don't know if Villeneuve is going to adapt Dune Messiah and kind of be faithful to that book, or kind of show us what happened you know during that Holy War period, um, to where Paul is now the emperor of the Imperium. So that remains to be seen, but but even if we don't get another Dune movie from Denis Villeneuve, hopefully there'll be a director out there who kind of steps in and says, "Well, I think I know where to take this."
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Or like I said, maybe a good opportunity. Like we're seeing more and more shows being part of it. Is this something where we get kind of this like continuation of maybe the series in a different format? So there's loads of ways that you could take it. But yeah, it's just kind of interesting. I think when you think of kind of the overarching story, it's like almost these things are prequel to the bigger thing, which is the Holy War, which plays, in the grand scheme of things, a much larger impact on the Dune universe.
right.
But yeah, it's obviously it has enough of a tight knit story to get everything done that it need to get done.
Well,
But I'm sure for people that watched it, going to be interested to see, you want more. And where do you go from here? I'm not too sure.
well, you know what I'm thinking here, right? Is let's say Denis Villeneuve does make Dune another Dune movie, and it's based, or it's an adaptation of Dune Messiah, right? Obviously, we would have questions of, hey, what happened during the Holy War? Maybe they might do like a mini series, kind of like with what they did with God Monarch, um,
Hmm.
and kind of bridge that gap of what happened between part one and the third, and the third Dune movie, you know.
Yeah.
So maybe that's a possibility right there, because because that would fill in the gap, but that would also allow Dennis Villeneuve and his creative team to kind of tell the story their own way, while being faithful to the tone that Frank Herbert set in the Dune universe. So what's your overall score for Dune Part Two?
Yeah, so I would give this 4.5, riding the sandworm, out of 5. I just think that, like I said, it's exactly what you want from a sequel, right? Where the first one did a great job of building the universe, kind of getting us used to all this different terminology and everything. This really helps build up to it because you feel a lot more comfortable with the characters. There's a lot more focus on that. And like I said, we still get kind of the overarching narrative. So I think it did a great job of that. Definitely a strong sequel to follow up a strong first entry.
Yeah, so I would probably give it 4.4 out of 5 sandworms. And and generally, there's nothing about Dune Part Two I didn't like, right? But I did feel like I did feel like the villainous house of Harkonnen, or villainous house Harkonnen, they could have played a much more proactive role rather than just take sitting in the back seat and just taking the blows and really not doing anything, just being these fearsome calculating warriors that you see in Part One to these bumbling half-wits that you see in Part Two. Um, I will say they kind of, I sort of feel like they kind of overdid it sometimes with the whole prophecy thing. Because I understand what they're trying to do. They're trying to like push the narrative that Paul is supposed to be this long-awaited Messiah for the Fremen. But I felt like if they focus less on that, maybe that might have reduced the runtime of the movie a little bit, because because we sort of get the idea already. They've laid the foundation in Part One. Lady Jessica kind of you know mentions it every now and then, but I feel like they kind of overdid it. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Um,
no, that's fair.
but I mean like for the most part, I genuinely felt like the strongest, obviously the strongest character is going to be Paul Atreides, but I think Chani also plays a much more robust role in the movie, and I thought Zendaya did a phenomenal job in that role. And yeah, I think you made the joke too about oh, I hope Spider-Man doesn't find out about this,
Yeah, yeah.
because who's she going to choose? Is she going to choose an Avenger, or is she going to choose a Duke?
Mm-hmm.
but
True.
um, but I also mentioned to you too that 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 Dune Part Two pretty much takes two classical movies and just puts them together, and it melds them together pretty well too, because you've got this romantic freedom fighting aspect of Lawrence of Arabia with this sort of dark cultish atmosphere that you see in Apocalypse Now, right? Um, and in both cases, you could sort of see how this figure goes from this sort of humble, well, Paul's not really from a humble origin because he's Duke, but you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I
He's
know what you mean.
but he goes from this rather humble exile to becoming this exalted leader, and you could sort of make the argument that Paul, at the end, Paul is sort of relishing in his newfound role as this leader of a cult, right? After resisting for so long, now he's come to the realization that I have to embrace this role. And he, did you get that vibe from him? Did you kind of feel like he was starting to enjoy being in that role?
Yeah, I think once he got all the powers, I think his mindset became clear, right? Like, if you were to see a future where you saw the whole galaxy being happy, right, just living in peace, like I think he would fight to just do everything you could to get that. So I think he absolutely leaned into it because I think the powers really helped provide that clarity to him on what he needed to do.
But don't you think, like, he, even before he drank the water of life, don't you think his visions were, I guess, quote unquote, clear, because he did see, what would happen, billions dying in his name in a holy war, and that ends up materializing.
He does say that. I think visually, we just kind of see like the desert stuff. So I won't pass judgment on that because we never really saw I don't know. At least for me, I didn't really interpret what we were seeing as the Holy War, even though it was stated. I know it was said in the movie like that, but it always just kind of seemed more like, I don't know. It just seemed to deal more with the Fremen than anything else.
Okay. So in other words, it was more local than it was, I guess.
Yeah, exactly.
Universal.
Yeah, I
Okay.
interpret it more like the South was a lot more inhabited than anyone thought, right? And that's how I interpret it, was like her going to the South, she's gonna get the South involved, the South gonna lead to all this death on Arrakis, not necessarily going out to other places, which is where the story does eventually. That's just how I looked at it, and that's how I interpreted what I was seeing on this.
Okay, gotcha. Well, that's going to do it for our review of Dune Part 2. Let us know down in the comments below what you think, if you agree with our assessments or if you think we're talking shit. And we promise to do more full reviews. We're both doing very well. We're happy and healthy. Lee, you happy and healthy? You got no bugs lingering in your system?
Hopefully not.
Okay, gotcha. But we'll work to get more reviews out to you guys. But in the meantime, if you're missing us or if you just want to check out more reviews, you can check out our previous episodes and the playlist below. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and we'll catch you in the next episode. Bye.